In the final days of the First World War, deep in the lands of the Ottoman Empire, one battle would reshape the entire Middle Eastern front. A swift and devastating offensive, a masterstroke of deception and speed, and a victory so complete that it shattered an empire's hold over an entire region. This was the Battle of Megiddo. Welcome to ASMR War History, where we bring the past to life in a calm and immersive way. If you enjoy deep dives into history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue telling these incredible stories. Now, let's begin with an overview of the battle. The Battle of Megiddo, fought from the 19th to the 25th of September in the year 1918, marked the final Allied offensive of the Sinai and Palestine campaign in the First World War. The conflict unfolded across a vast expanse, stretching from the coastal plain of Sharon to the Judean hills, and further into the Esdraelon plain near Nazareth, Afula, and Basin. It was a battle not just of brute force, but of strategy and speed, one that would ultimately bring the Ottoman presence in the region to its knees. The name of the battle, chosen by British Commander General Allenby, carried deep historical and symbolic significance. Though limited fighting occurred near the ancient site of Tel Megiddo, its association with legendary conflicts of the past gave weight to the victory that would unfold. The battle pitted the Allied Egyptian Expeditionary Force, composed of 3 corps, including one of mounted troops, against the Ottoman Yildirim army group, a force that, despite being spread across 3 armies, was barely equivalent to a single Allied corps in strength. The stage was set across what was then the heart of Ottoman Palestine, covering present-day Israel, Syria, and Jordan. The operation began with an elaborate deception. As forces of the Arab Revolt struck at the Ottoman lines of communication, drawing their attention away from the main front, British and Indian infantry divisions launched a set-piece attack in the Battle of Sharon. With the support of creeping barrages, they tore through the Ottoman defensive lines along the coastal sector. As their grip on the front shattered, the Allied desert-mounted corps surged forward, rapidly exploiting the breach. Their objective was clear: to encircle the Ottoman 7th and 8th armies still engaged in battle in the Judean hills. Simultaneously, the subsidiary Battle of Nablus erupted in the hills surrounding the city and along the crossings of the Jordan River. Meanwhile, further east, the Ottoman 4th Army faced relentless attacks in the hills of Moab, near Es Salt and Amman. With each passing hour, the Ottoman defensive structure crumbled, leaving them with little room for escape. The results were nothing short of staggering. Tens of thousands of Ottoman troops were captured, and vast swathes of territory fell to the Allies. The victories continued beyond the initial engagements. Dara fell on the 27th of September, Damascus on the 1st of October, and by the time British forces reached the outskirts of Aleppo, operations were still ongoing when the Armistice of Mudros was signed, formally ending hostilities between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies. The triumph at Megiddo was a stark contrast to the drawn-out, bloody offensives that had characterized much of the First World War. Allenby's success lay in his ability to blend modern firepower with rapid mobility. The precise coordination of artillery barrages allowed the infantry to break through entrenched lines, while cavalry, armoured cars, and aircraft ensured that retreating Ottoman forces had no time to regroup. The irregular fighters of the Arab Revolt also played a vital role, harassing Ottoman supply lines and accelerating the collapse of their defences. It was a campaign defined by speed and decisiveness, one that reshaped the final days of the war in the Middle East and sealed the fate of the Ottoman presence in the region. So let us rewind. The ancient fortress of Megiddo, standing atop the heights of Tel El Mutasalim, had watched countless armies pass beneath its shadow. From the ancient Egyptians to the legions of Napoleon, the valley had long been a battlefield of empires. By the year 1918, this vast plain, now known as the Plain of Esdraelon, was still of vital strategic importance. It connected the Jordan Valley and the Plain of Sharon, stretching 40 miles behind the Ottoman front line. These three valleys together formed a natural semicircle around the main Ottoman positions in the Judean hills, where the 7th and 8th Ottoman armies were dug in. 4 years earlier, in November of 1914, the Entente powers had declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The conflict in the Middle East soon revolved around one crucial artery of the British Empire, the Suez Canal. The Ottomans, with German assistance, launched 2 separate invasions of Egypt, seeking to seize the canal and sever Britain's vital link to India, Australia, and New Zealand. British forces under General Archibald Murray repelled the attacks, pushing the Ottoman army back across the Sinai Desert. By constructing a railway and water pipeline across the harsh terrain, the British secured their supply lines and went on the offensive. However, their attempts to break into Palestine ended in failure at the First and Second Battles of Gaza in early 1917. Meanwhile, in the Hejaz, a different kind of war had begun. The Arab revolt, led by Sharif Hussein bin Ali and his sons, sought to overthrow Ottoman rule. With British support, they launched a campaign of sabotage and guerrilla warfare against the Hejaz Railway, the lifeline of Ottoman forces in the region. By July of 1917, the revolt had captured the strategic port of Aqaba, allowing Britain to supply the Arab rebels and extending the conflict northward. That same year, the British-Egyptian Expeditionary Force gained new leadership. General Edmund Allenby took command, bringing a fresh approach to the campaign. Under his leadership, the British shattered the Ottoman lines at the Third Battle of Gaza and pursued the retreating enemy northward, winning another decisive victory at the Battle of Mogar Ridge. By December, Jerusalem fell to British forces, marking a turning point in the war. However, the momentum of the British offensive was soon checked by events unfolding in Europe. In March of 1918, Germany launched a massive spring offensive on the Western Front, threatening to break through the Allied lines in France and Belgium. To reinforce the European theatre, Allenby was forced to send 2 full divisions, along with thousands of infantry, cavalry and artillery units, back to France. His tank force was also recalled. In total, 60,000 men were withdrawn from the Middle Eastern theatre. Despite this setback, Allenby kept the pressure on the Ottoman armies, launching 2 offensives across the Jordan River. The first attack succeeded in cutting the Hejaz railway near Amman, but the attackers were forced to retreat. In the second attempt, British and Indian forces captured Es Salt, only to withdraw when Ottoman counterattacks threatened their supply lines. Though neither offensive achieved its objectives, they disrupted the Ottomans and forced them to commit troops to the defence of the Jordan Valley. At the same time, major changes were taking place within the Ottoman command. Since the fall of Jerusalem, the Yildirim army group, charged with defending Palestine, had undergone a leadership shake-up. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German officer who had commanded the Ottoman forces, was dismissed. His strategy of gradual withdrawal had angered Ottoman officers, who blamed him for the defeats at Gaza and Jerusalem. In his place, General Otto Liman von Sanders took command. Liman believed that further retreat would demoralize his troops and embolden the Arab revolt. Instead, he chose to hold the line and resist the British advance. By the summer of 1918, the strategic situation for the Ottomans appeared more stable than that of their German allies. Their forces in Mesopotamia were holding against British offensives, and in the Caucasus they had launched an ambitious campaign, seizing vast territories in Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia. Many within the Ottoman High Command believed that Lyman von Sanders could achieve another victory, just as he had done at Gallipoli. However, not all Ottoman commanders shared this confidence. Some saw the British preparations and feared the worst. They argued that the army should retreat to a stronger defensive position farther north, forcing the British to attack across open ground. But Lyman von Sanders refused to abandon his carefully prepared defences. During the summer of 1918, General Allenby's forces were restored to full strength, readying for a decisive offensive. Reinforcements arrived from multiple fronts, with 2 cavalry divisions, the 4th and 5th, transferred from the Western Front. These divisions were reorganised, incorporating British yeomanry regiments into 5 of their 6 brigades. Meanwhile, 2 Indian infantry divisions, the 3rd Lahore and 7th Meerut, arrived from Mesopotamia to replace units sent to Europe. 4 of Allenby's infantry divisions, the 10th, 53rd, 60th and 75th, were restructured in the British Indian Army format, with each brigade consisting of 3 Indian and 1 British battalion. An exception was found in the 53rd Division, where 1 brigade contained a mix of British, South African and Indian battalions. The 54th East Anglian Division remained entirely British, but was reinforced with a brigade-sized detachment of French forces from Palestine and Syria. While these reorganisations took place, the front remained relatively quiet, though occasional clashes continued. One such engagement occurred on July 19th, when Ottoman and German forces launched an attack at Abu Tellul near the Jordan River. Australian light horse regiments swiftly countered the assault, inflicting heavy losses on the German 11th Reserve Jaeger Battalion, forcing its withdrawal from Palestine. As Allenby strengthened his position, the Arab Northern Army under Emir Faisal operated east of the Jordan, maintaining pressure on Ottoman positions. Faisal's headquarters were stationed at Aba el-Lisan, roughly 15 miles southwest of Mayun, where an Ottoman garrison remained under siege. British support to Faisal's forces flowed through the port of Aqaba, providing essential supplies, including weapons, ammunition, and financial aid. In addition to logistical assistance, the British assigned liaison officers, detachments of armoured cars, Indian machine gunners, and a French-Algerian mountain battery to bolster the Arab forces. The most significant contribution, however, came in the form of financial support. What had initially begun as a subsidy of £30,000 in mid-1916 had expanded dramatically by the time of the Megiddo offensive, reaching £220,000 per month. The Arab Northern Army, composed of 2,000 regular troops, continued to blockade the Ottoman-held Ma'an. These forces were led by Jafar Pasha, a former Ottoman officer who had once been assigned to instigate a rebellion against the British in Egypt, but had defected to the Arab revolt after his capture. Most of his troops were former Ottoman Arab conscripts who had deserted or, like Jafar, had switched allegiance after becoming prisoners of war. Meanwhile, Arab irregular forces, operating from Aba el-Lisan and Aqaba, carried out relentless raids on the Hejaz Railway. Often accompanied by British officers, such as T.E. Lawrence. These raids targeted Ottoman supply lines, damaging infrastructure and disrupting troop movements. Following Allenby's second failed offensive across the Jordan, the Arab forces escalated their sabotage efforts, demolishing sections of railway over an 80-mile stretch near Mudawara. This effectively crippled Ottoman supply operations to Medina, marking the end of active Ottoman control in the Hejaz. Despite the impact of the Arab revolt, not all British officers viewed their role in the campaign as critical. Some, like Rex Hall of the 5th Light Horse Brigade, believed the Arab forces under Lawrence were more of a nuisance than a decisive factor in Allenby's operations. Nonetheless, their actions played a role in stretching Ottoman resources thin, further weakening their ability to resist the coming offensive. General Allenby's strategy hinged on a decisive breakthrough at the western end of the Ottoman line, where the open terrain favoured cavalry manoeuvres. His plan was to exploit this gap with swift-moving horsemen, driving deep into the enemy's rear, cutting off their 7th and 8th armies from escape or reinforcements. To set the stage, the Arab Northern Army was ordered to strike the Ottoman railway junction at Dara on September 16th. This attack was meant to disrupt enemy communications and draw attention away from Allenby's main offensive. At the same time, British infantry from the 20th Corps, under Lieutenant General Philip Chetwode, would mount an assault in the Judean hills, beginning on the night of September 18th. This would serve two purposes. First, it would further mislead the Ottomans into focusing on the Jordan Valley, and second, it would allow British forces to position themselves for blocking Ottoman retreat routes across the Jordan River. Once the main attack commenced, these forces were to capture the Ottoman 7th Army's headquarters in Nablus and cut off its escape route to the east. The decisive breakthrough was planned for September 19th. The 21st Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Edward Bulfin, would launch an all-out assault along an 8-mile front on the Mediterranean coast. 4 divisions would spearhead the attack, with a 5th division striking further inland to add pressure. Once the Ottoman defences were shattered, British forces would rapidly advance to capture the headquarters of the Ottoman 8th Army at Tolkam and seize the vital lateral railway at Mesoudieh, an essential supply line connecting the Ottoman 7th and 8th armies. But the most crucial blow would come from the Desert-Mounted Corps under Lieutenant General Harry Chauvel. This force of 3 mounted divisions was positioned behind the leading infantry units, waiting for the moment to charge. Once the Ottoman defences crumbled, Chauvel's cavalry would ride north at speed, pushing through the mountain passes of the Carmel Range before the Ottomans could react. Their objective was to seize Al-Afuleh and Bazan, key communication hubs. If successful, this manoeuvre would completely sever Ottoman supply lines and leave every enemy unit west of the Jordan River trapped. In parallel, a separate force under Major General Edward Chaytor, known as Chaytor's Force, was assigned the crucial task of seizing the Jizr ed-Damia bridge and surrounding fords. This would block any remaining Ottoman forces from retreating across the Jordan and enable a later push toward Es-Salt and Amman. Chaytor's detachment was an eclectic mix of soldiers, consisting of the Anzac Mounted Division, the 20th Indian Infantry Brigade, 2 battalions of the British West Indies Regiment, and 2 battalions of Jewish volunteers from the Royal Fusiliers. In total, this force numbered 11,000 men. Secrecy was vital to the success of the operation. If the Ottomans discovered Allenby's true intentions, they might preemptively withdraw from the coastal sector, denying the British the opportunity for a decisive engagement. Elaborate deception efforts were put in place to convince the enemy that the main attack would come from the Jordan Valley rather than the Mediterranean coast. Movements of troops and supplies were carefully choreographed. Personnel and vehicles travelling westward toward the Mediterranean did so under the cover of night, while those moving eastward toward the Jordan did so openly during the day. The Anzac Mounted Division staged an elaborate ruse, simulating the presence of an entire mounted corps in the Jordan Valley. Soldiers would march openly into the valley during daylight hours, only to be secretly transported out by truck at night, repeating the process the next day to maintain the illusion. Dust clouds were artificially generated, using mules dragging harrows along tracks, simulating large troop movements. Dummy encampments were constructed, and a Jerusalem hotel was ostentatiously requisitioned for what appeared to be an expeditionary force headquarters. To further sell the deception, an audacious raid was conducted east of the Jordan River. British troops from the Imperial Camel Corps, alongside Arab irregulars, struck the Hejaz Railway, capturing and destroying the station at Modawara, effectively cutting the Ottoman lifeline to Medina. Meanwhile, small reconnaissance parties scattered empty cans of corned beef and British documents near Amman, leaving behind physical evidence of their presence. Agents of the Arab Revolt openly purchased massive quantities of forage in the region, further hinting at a major Entente operation in the east. As a final flourish, British newspapers and official communications were filled with reports of a grand horse race set to take place on September 19th, the very day the real offensive was scheduled to begin. Though these deception efforts failed to completely fool General Lyman von Sanders into redeploying his forces toward the Jordan, they still succeeded in concealing Allenby's true objective. By the time the British assault began, Allenby had quietly amassed a force along the Mediterranean flank that outnumbered the Ottoman 22nd Corps by nearly 5-1 in infantry and even more in artillery. Earlier in the year, British forces had already laid the groundwork for success. On June 9th, elements of the 7th Meerut Division had captured 2 key hills inland from the coast, depriving the Ottomans of important vantage points that could have revealed British movements. Additionally, the Royal Engineers had quietly established a bridging school on the Nahr al-Auja River much earlier in the year. By the time several bridges suddenly appeared across the river on the eve of the battle, they aroused no suspicion among Ottoman observers. Now, with his forces in position and the enemy unaware of the scale of the coming assault, Allenby was ready to launch what would become one of the most decisive victories of the First World War. The success of Allenby's deceptions and the concealment of his true strength relied heavily on the complete dominance of the skies by Entente forces. British and Australian squadrons outnumbered and outclassed the Ottoman and German air units, rendering them nearly ineffective by the time the battle began. In the weeks leading up to the offensive, enemy aerial activity dropped drastically. In June, German reconnaissance planes had crossed the British lines 100 times in a single week, conducting high-altitude raids between 16,000 and 18,000 feet. But by late August, that number had fallen to just 18 crossings. In the 3 weeks leading up to the battle, only 4 enemy aircraft managed to venture over Allied positions. By mid-September, German reconnaissance planes could not even take off without being intercepted by British or Australian fighters. The result was devastating. Ottoman and German intelligence had no way of piercing Allenby's elaborate deception efforts, nor could they detect the true Allied build-up that lay hidden among orange groves and dense plantations. On the ground, the Ottomans were spread thin across a vast defensive line. Under the Yildirim Army Group, 3 armies were positioned from the Mediterranean coast to the Hejaz Railway. On the westernmost end, the 8th Army under Javad Pasha defended the coastal sector with 5 divisions, a cavalry division, and the German Pasha II detachment, which was the size of a regiment. Further inland, in the rugged terrain of the Judean hills, Mustafa Kemal Pasha commanded the 7th Army with 4 divisions and a German regiment. The 4th Army, led by Jamal Mersinli Pasha, was split into 2 forces, one defending the British-held bridgeheads on the Jordan River with 2 divisions, while the other guarded the key cities of Amman and Ma'an against attacks from the Arab Revolt. By August 1918, the Yildirim Army Group had just over 40,000 combat-ready infantry, with fewer than 20,000 rifles in working condition. Their firepower consisted of over 270 light and nearly 700 heavy machine guns, supported by a total of 402 artillery pieces. Although the Ottomans had roughly estimated the overall size of Allenby's forces, they had no clear intelligence on where the attack would fall. With no strategic reserves available beyond scattered depot regiments and garrison units, Lyman von Sanders had little choice but to stretch his forces evenly across the entire front. The result was a dangerously thin defensive line with no depth. After 4 years of relentless warfare, most Ottoman units were under strength and struggling with widespread desertion, disease, and supply shortages. Yet Lyman placed his faith in the determination of the Turkish infantry and the strength of their defensive fortifications. His men had a high concentration of artillery and machine guns, far more than most Ottoman armies in the war, but their defences lacked the deep barbed wire belts seen on the Western Front. Even more critically, Lyman underestimated how much British tactics had evolved. Over the past year, Allenby's forces had perfected the art of set-piece offensives, short, devastating artillery barrages, guided by aerial reconnaissance, followed by rapid advances that left defenders no time to recover. These tactics had already shattered Ottoman lines at Beersheba, Gaza, and Jerusalem. Now, with complete air superiority, Allenby was preparing to unleash them once again. On the night of September 16th, 1918, Arab forces under T.E. Lawrence and Nuri as-Said launched a series of devastating attacks on Ottoman railway lines near the vital hub of Dara. This junction connected the Hejaz Railway, which supplied the Ottoman garrison in Amman, with the Palestine Railway, which kept the Ottoman armies in Palestine operational. Lawrence's initial strike force included a Camel Corps unit from Faisal's army, an Egyptian Camel Corps unit, Gurkha machine gunners, British and Australian armoured cars, and French mountain artillery. Soon, their numbers swelled as thousands of Ruwala and Hawaitat tribesmen joined the assault, led by the renowned fighting chiefs Auda Abu Tai and Nuri al-Shalan. Though Allenby had instructed Lawrence to simply disrupt communications around Dara for a week, events quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Entire communities spontaneously rose up against Ottoman rule, forcing the defenders to divert reinforcements from Al-Afule to protect Dara. Meanwhile, in the hills above the Jordan Valley, British forces under Chetwode's corps launched their own diversionary attacks on September 17th and 18th. Their objective was to seize key high ground overlooking Ottoman roads to disrupt the enemy's ability to manoeuvre. Some positions were taken quickly, but others, like Nayan Ridge, were fiercely defended. It was only on the night of September 19th that British troops finally secured the ridge, allowing engineers to link captured roads to the Allied supply network. In the final hours before Allenby's main offensive, an unexpected complication arose. A deserter from an Indian unit informed the Ottomans of the impending attack. Concerned that this intelligence might be accurate, Refet Bey, the commander of the Ottoman 22nd Corps, requested permission to withdraw and reposition his troops. But his superiors, Jevad Pasha and Lyman von Sanders, dismissed the warning, fearing it might be an elaborate deception by the British. Then, at 1 o'clock in the morning on September 19th, the Royal Air Force struck the first blow of the main offensive. A single Handley Page heavy bomber from the Palestine Brigade took off into the darkness, loaded with 16 112-pound bombs. It flew straight to Al-Afule, where it destroyed the central telephone exchange and railway station. The impact was immediate. Lyman's headquarters in Nazareth was cut off from both the 7th and 8th Ottoman armies for the next 2 days, leaving them effectively blind in the crucial opening phase of battle. At the same time, squadrons of British DH-9 bombers targeted key Ottoman infrastructure. El-Afule's railway junction and telephone exchange were shattered, while the headquarters of the Ottoman 7th Army at Nablus was struck with relentless precision. The coordination of these air raids crippled Ottoman communications just as Allenby's main attack was about to begin. Then at 4:30 in the morning, the silence along the front was shattered. A massive Entente artillery barrage erupted as 385 British guns, along with 60 trench mortars and even 2 naval destroyers offshore, pounded the Ottoman 7th and 20th Divisions along the Nar el Falik line. The bombardment was precise and relentless, battering enemy positions before shifting into a lifting barrage that paved the way for the advancing British and Indian infantry. Within hours, the Ottoman defences had been shattered, and the desert-mounted corps surged north along the coast, unopposed. By mid-morning, the scale of the breakthrough was staggering. If an enemy observer had been in the skies over the battlefield, they would have witnessed one of the most dramatic cavalry movements of the war. 94 squadrons of horsemen spread across the plains, racing forward with relentless speed and purpose. It was a moment that every cavalryman had dreamed of, but that few had ever experienced in reality. Concentration, surprise, and speed, the very elements that Allenby had so carefully planned, were now fully unleashed. By nightfall, the British 60th Division had reached Tulkarm, and what remained of the Ottoman 8th Army was in full retreat, pursued by Australian airmen strafing their columns from above. At the defile at Messudier, German officers desperately tried to rally the fleeing soldiers, while rearguards formed under the command of Oberst Gustav von Oppen. But it was already too late. The headquarters of the Ottoman 22nd Corps had been overrun. Its commander, Refet Bey, barely escaped. Jevad Pasha, the leader of the 8th Army, had fled. And with the total collapse of the Ottoman right flank, even Mustafa Kemal Pasha at 7th Army headquarters was powerless to regain control. Throughout the day, German aircraft stationed at Jenin remained grounded. British pilots, flying in rotating shifts, took turns circling the airfield. Any attempt by the Germans to take off was met with immediate attack. By sundown, the enemy's ability to mount a counterattack had been entirely neutralized. The breakthrough Allenby had envisioned was now a reality. The Ottoman lines had been torn apart, and their armies were unravelling. The race to encircle them had begun. In the early hours of September 20th, 1918, the desert-mounted corps seized the vital defiles of the Carmel Range, opening the way for a swift advance into the heart of Ottoman-held territory. The 4th Mounted Division surged forward, capturing Afula and Bison, along with the bulk of 2 depot regiments. Meanwhile, a brigade from the 5th Mounted Division launched an assault on Nazareth, where Lyman von Sanders had established his headquarters. Though his troops fought fiercely, Lyman himself managed to escape. By late afternoon, a brigade from the Australian Mounted Division swept into Jenin, cutting off the retreat of thousands of fleeing Ottoman soldiers. Just days later, on September 23rd, the 15th Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade stormed the port city of Haifa, securing another critical stronghold for the advancing Allied forces. With nothing now standing between Allenby's forces and Mustafa Kemal Pasha's 7th Army at Nablus, the Ottoman commander was faced with a grim reality. His army was heavily outnumbered and exhausted from weeks of fighting. With the rail lines cut and no clear path for withdrawal, his only escape route lay to the east, down the Nablus Basin Road into the Jordan Valley. As the 7th Army began its evacuation of Nablus on the night of September 20th, it became the last intact Ottoman fighting force west of the Jordan River. Though Chetwode's 20th Corps had been pushing to cut off their retreat, Ottoman rearguards had managed to slow their advance just enough to keep the escape route open. But on the morning of September 21st, Ottoman troops were spotted from the air as they moved through a narrow defile west of the river. Within moments, waves of British aircraft descended on the column. The Royal Air Force pounded the retreating soldiers relentlessly, unleashing a storm of bombs and machine gun fire. The assault had been planned to last 5 hours, but within just 60 minutes, the 7th Army was utterly annihilated. The wreckage of the shattered column stretched for more than 6 miles, a landscape of burning vehicles, abandoned artillery, and bodies. British cavalry later scoured the battlefield, recovering 87 artillery pieces, 55 motor lorries, 4 motor cars, 75 carts, more than 800 wagons, and untold amounts of abandoned supplies. The Ottoman forces had been decimated. T.E. Lawrence would later write, "The RAF lost 4 killed. The Turks lost a corps." The effectiveness of Allenby's plan stunned military observers. His strategy was executed with such precision that his biographer later described it as brilliant in execution as it had been in conception. It was unlike anything seen in France or on any other front. In fact, some would later compare it in principle, and even in detail, to the Blitzkrieg tactics of 1939. As the 4th Cavalry Division and the Australian Mounted Division pressed forward, they encountered vast numbers of demoralised Ottoman troops, many of whom surrendered without resistance. Those who managed to cross the Jordan found themselves at the mercy of Arab forces, who attacked the fleeing soldiers as they neared Daraa. Meanwhile, Lyman von Sanders attempted to mount a final defensive stand at Samak, a critical stronghold on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. His forces aimed to establish a new defensive line, stretching from Lake Hula to Daraa. But in the pre-dawn hours of September 25th, 1.5 regiments of Australian Light Horse launched a daring charge into the town. Intense hand-to-hand combat raged through the streets, but by morning the town had fallen. With Samak lost, any hope of re-establishing a defensive line was shattered. As the battle in the north reached its climax, the British advance in the Judean hills resumed. By midday on September 21st, the 10th Division and the Australian 5th Light Horse Brigade had secured Nablus. At the same time, the British 53rd Division, which had been advancing towards the Wadi El Farah road, halted its movement. It was clear that the Ottoman forces in the area had been completely destroyed by aerial bombardment, leaving nothing left to pursue. But the fight was not over. At Daraa, German and Ottoman aircraft continued to operate, launching raids against Arab insurgents who were attacking rail lines and isolated Ottoman outposts. In response, Lawrence urged the British to establish a forward airbase at El Surab. By September 22nd, Bristol fighters had taken to the skies, shooting down several enemy aircraft. The powerful Handley Page bomber ferried in fuel and supplies, before launching devastating attacks on the Ottoman airfields at Daraa and Mafraq, effectively silencing them. Meanwhile, on the western side of the Jordan River, the Ottoman 53rd Division found itself under heavy assault. Meldrum's force, a mixed unit of New Zealand mounted rifles, British West Indies troops, and Indian mountain artillery, stormed their headquarters near the Wadi El Farah road. Within hours, the Ottoman commander had been captured, along with 600 prisoners. Pressing forward, Meldrum's men smashed through determined Ottoman rearguards and seized the Jisr ed-Damia bridge, tightening the noose around the retreating Fourth Army. At the same time, Lyman von Sanders finally ordered the remnants of the Fourth Army to withdraw from the Jordan Valley and fall back to Daraa and Irbid. But the order came too late. As the Ottoman columns attempted to retreat, British and Australian aircraft launched relentless strikes on the roads between Es Salt and Amman. The devastation was immense. Hundreds of vehicles were reduced to smouldering wrecks, and entire units collapsed into chaos. By September 25th, those Ottoman troops who had reached Mafraq by train found themselves trapped. The railway ahead had been destroyed, and heavy air attacks tore through their ranks, scattering the survivors in all directions. Many fled into the desert in desperation, but a disciplined corps of troops, having abandoned their vehicles, pressed on toward Daraa on foot and horseback. That same day, Chaytor's force advanced across the Jordan, capturing Amman. Meanwhile, an Ottoman detachment retreating from Ma'an found its route blocked at Ziza, south of Amman. With no means of escape, and facing the brutal possibility of being slaughtered by Arab forces, they surrendered en masse to the Anzac Mounted Division on September 28th. Allenby's offensive had been an overwhelming success. The 7th and 8th Ottoman armies had been annihilated. The 4th Army was in full retreat. The enemy's entire front had collapsed, and the war in Palestine was nearing its end. In his final address to his troops, Allenby reflected on the magnitude of their victory. "I desire to convey to all ranks and all arms of the force under my command my admiration and thanks for their great deeds of the past week, and my appreciation of their gallantry and determination, which have resulted in the total destruction of the 7th and 8th Turkish armies opposed to us. Such a complete victory has seldom been known in all the history of war." With the destruction of the Ottoman 7th and 8th armies, Allenby turned his attention to the final prize, Damascus. He ordered his cavalry across the Jordan to capture Dara and push northward, while infantry divisions advanced along the Mediterranean coast toward Beirut and through the Bekaa Valley to seize Baalbek, where the Ottomans had positioned their last major supply depots and reinforcement camps. By September 27th, the 4th Mounted Division reached Dara, only to find that Arab forces had already overrun the town. The retreating Ottoman columns, fearing pursuit, had committed brutal atrocities against hostile Arab villages. In response, the Arab forces showed no mercy, wiping out an entire Ottoman brigade, including German and Austrian units, near the village of Tafas. Jamal Pasha himself barely escaped with his life. General Barrow, leading the British cavalry, met with Sharif Faisal's Arab forces at Tafas and proposed they take the right flank in the attack on Damascus. This suited the Arab army well, as another force under Sharif Nasir of Mecca had been shadowing the main Ottoman retreat along the Hejaz railway, launching relentless attacks day and night. The Arabs struck again the following day, suffering several hundred casualties, but inflicting devastating losses on the enemy. Nearly 5,000 Ottoman troops were wiped out in 2 brutal engagements. Meanwhile, the 5th Mounted Division and the Australian Mounted Division pressed northward across the Golan Heights. Fierce clashes erupted at Banat Yaqub, Quneitra, Sassa and Katana as the cavalry force carved its way through to the approaches of Damascus. By September 29th, they had closed off the city's northern and northwestern escape routes. The walls of Damascus were now surrounded by Arab and British imperial forces. With no hope of victory, the remaining Ottoman and German troops quickly surrendered. The final blow came on September 30th, when Australian cavalry intercepted a last desperate attempt by the Ottoman garrison to retreat through the Barada Gorge. The following day, October 1st, Damascus fell. The Allies marched in, capturing 20,000 prisoners in the process. Jamal Pasha, unable to rally any resistance, fled the city. By the time the dust settled, the entire campaign had resulted in the surrender of 75,000 Ottoman soldiers. The Ottoman forces in Palestine, once feared and well disciplined, had been shattered beyond repair. But the campaign was not yet over. With Damascus secured, the 5th Mounted Division, along with detachments from the Arab Northern Army, advanced northward into the heart of Syria. They reached Aleppo on October 26th, pushing ever deeper into the crumbling Ottoman defences. At Muslimiyah, they met fierce resistance. Mustafa Kemal Pasha, who had now replaced Lehman von Sanders as commander of the Yildirim army group, rallied what little remained of the Ottoman forces. Kemal's men, hardened and desperate, held their positions against the British and Arab advance, determined to salvage what they could. But it was too late. On October 31st, hostilities ceased. The Ottoman Empire, having suffered total strategic collapse, signed the Armistice of Mudros, ending the war in the Middle East. The Battle of Megiddo, along with its subsidiary battles at Sharon and Nablus, was recognised as one of the most decisive victories of the war. The battlefield honour Megiddo was awarded to British, Dominion and Empire forces that took part in the offensive. The psychological impact of the defeat was staggering. The Ottoman High Command, reeling from the catastrophe, knew their time was up. Historian Edward Eriksson would later compare the collapse of the Ottoman armies to the Black Days of the German army, stating, "The Battle of the Nablus Plain ranks with Ludendorff's darkest moments." It was now clear to all but the most die-hard nationalists that the Turks were finished in the war. Even with victories in Armenia and Azerbaijan, Turkey's position was indefensible. The collapse of the Bulgarian army in Salonika and the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian forces left no doubt the Central Powers were doomed. From this moment until the final armistice, Ottoman strategy was no longer about winning, but about salvaging whatever territory they could before the end. The war in the Middle East was over. The Ottoman Empire, once a vast and mighty force, was now a shadow of its former self. The victory at Megiddo had not only sealed the fate of the Ottomans, but had set the stage for the post-war world. A world where new nations would rise, empires would fall, and the map of the Middle East would be forever changed. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. The Battle of Megiddo was a turning point in the First World War, a moment where strategy, deception, and relentless speed shattered an empire. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more immersive war history, be sure to like and subscribe to ASMR War History. Your support helps us continue bringing you these stories in the most relaxing way possible. And as always, sleep well, my friends.